All right, so we're on to section 3D here, God's ordination of civil governance. Romans 13, 1 through 7 specifies that God ordains the administration of civil justice. This involves the legitimate use of coercive retribution against aggressors, those who commit aggression against another person or property, enforcing restitution by aggressors to their victims. According to God's ordination, civil governance is strictly limited to this task. The civil rulers to which all should submit are those that administer actual civil justice. The claim to civil power or exercise of power or coercion on any pretense that violates civil justice is not ordained by God according to Scripture and may be legitimately resisted. It is not only orders to sin that must be refused, but any would-be civil regulation beyond the God-ordained sphere of civil justice that may be justly ignored. Those who are unjust are not legitimate authorities to whom believers should submit civil disputes among themselves. Okay, there's a lot there. I don't have a ton of questions in this section, but I think the natural question that comes up when we're talking about these civil rulers, what are, for lack of a better term, who elects these people? Like, how do we get, who is the civil ruler? How do we properly, like from a practical standpoint, I wouldn't care to keep our current system of electing civil rulers if there was actually the appropriate boundary set on what they can and cannot do. That doesn't mean that that's a legitimate way or an ethical way of going about establishing who the civil rulers are. But I guess I'm asking you, two questions. Who are these people? How do we get them? This stuff here.
Well, certainly a more limited, even a state, is definitely preferable. But properly speaking, just as in other spheres, someone who is involved in civil governance is similar to someone involved in any other sphere. How are civil magistrates? Just, you could ask, how are doctors? How do we get doctors? Who are these people, and how do we get them? Well, they're people who decide that they're interested in providing this service, and in a way we get them by people requiring their services. So, if I set myself up as a doctor, and let's say I'm the best doctor in the universe that there's ever been, but no one wants me to treat them, then, my expertise isn't really being used, and that doesn't, I don't have any right to say, well, I'm the best doctor in the universe that there's ever been. I'm going to perform an operation on you. In the same way, those who can serve as ministers of civil justice, people ought to require their services. And if no one does, setting yourself up as a judge on your own prerogative, or because you have a big gang and you're going to provide protection services, that's very, very clearly what the mafia does. So in this section, we're dealing specifically with Romans 13, 1 through 7. as a particular place, although there are other similar passages, for example, 1 Peter 2 and Titus 3, where God prescriptively ordains civil justice. Following that the sword that is being used stands for coercion, as we mentioned before, that this task is strictly limited, and that when it calls everyone, right, and it's not even accepting the magistrates too are involved in this, everyone, to submit to what's actually ordained. The violation of civil justice is not ordained, and so we may disobey not only what's immoral or sin, but we can also disregard injustice in terms of any kind of obligation on our part to follow it. And then, and the last part is that what Scripture requires of Christians in particular. So
yeah, I think one of the things I wrestle with when I engage in these conversations with fellow libertarians, or whatever label you want to attach to folks that are in our broader tent, it seems like that understanding of Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 and what magistrates and rulers are, it seems like we are imagining from the perspective of the original context, we're imagining what magistrates and rulers could be, rather than considering what these people would have understood magistrates and rulers as within their kind of immediate context and throughout more recent history for them. I'm just not sure when we talk about magistrates and how a magistrate would just kind of like set themselves up and say, use my services if you want. That seems ideal. It seems great that we would be able to have options. If there's 5 quote judges in the yellow pages, it'd be great to be able to choose which one we wanted to use based on their Google review. Like, I'd love that.
The particular theoretical perspectives of how a political system can be put into place in a modern Western society today, all of that is not what the scripture passage is teaching, right? So all our theorizing about what makes a good legal system, how it can be implemented, and all that kind of stuff, the claim in our position, the statement that we're making, we're not saying the Bible's teaching those things. So what we're saying the Bible is teaching is what I was saying before about what it is that God prescriptively ordains.
Right. The question that's being answered by Peter and by Paul is not answering a how question, but why or what question. It's not answering here's how the government should look, monarchy versus republic versus whatever, parliament. It's saying here's what legitimate. I mean, Romans 13, I think is really clear. He's saying, here's basically the purpose of a ruler. Here's what they should be doing. They should be rewarding good, punishing bad. And he's writing as Nero is on the throne, if you will, in Rome. We know that's not what Nero was all about.
That's right. And Paul knew that too.
Yeah. I mean,
and so he's not saying
there's like this brief season in Nero's life where he's doing all right. And then it's like, hey, this guy doesn't understand his right, the difference between left and right. And so clearly Paul cannot be saying that whatever the Caesar punishes is bad and whatever he rewards is good. Like, he's clearly not saying that.
That's right. And what he's addressing in principle in terms of the design of civil governance is something that can be expressed from Adam and Eve, from the fall through however long ago you might understand that to be, or however long ago it was, into the most technologically advanced, complex society possible. In other words, there's no human form of expressing this obediently that's outside of the possibility of the scope of its application.
Right.
And it can vary greatly. And so the central thrust of it has to do with God morally authorizing. And the article that I wrote addresses somewhat of the context. In other words, why would, and this might occur to people, why would Paul bring this up? What does this have to do with anything?
Yeah.
And the answer is because of what he said previously in the letter to the Romans, and because of the reality of the biggest bully on the block saying that he's the boss and he's in charge. The tendency would be for Christians to do what, in fact, many Christian anarchists who are not reformed have done, is say, civil governance is out.
Right.
We can't participate in that. So think of the Anabaptists, right? Well, some of
Right.
them. Of course, some of them had a quite different totalitarian view. But in any case, they're saying that's not a legitimate thing. And that's what Paul's addressing. Paul's addressing the impulse that you would have based on what he said before to say there is no legitimate use of coercion.
Yeah.
And he's saying, no, there is. And this establishes that a prescriptive ordination of the administration of civil justice. And in 1 Corinthians 6, that has to be followed up at the end. He forbids Christians from taking their civil disputes among themselves to the unjust.
Yeah.
And that's something that the Christian tradition has not, I don't think, taken account of in these questions seriously enough. It's been totally disregarded.
Yeah.